What's up guys, Asian here again with another build video, and today we're going to be going over the Magicka Templar. So the Magicka Templar is one of those DPS classes that not a lot of people play, at least in the very sort of end games content, you know, if you're going for scores or something like that. And that's mainly because Magicka Templars in general don't really have very good DPS when compared to Magicka Nightblades and Magicka DKs. They just kind of fall short a little bit, about 10-15% DPS difference there. So you won't find a lot of Magicka Templars in those kind of very endgame score pushing guilds. Now, where Magicka Templars do have a really good spot is going to be in progression style guilds, where when you are not necessarily pushing for score, you're kind of just pushing for clears, and that's mainly because Templars do have a passive that kind of decreases res time, and when you do res somebody, you res them back up with full health. So that's really nice to have in terms of group utility when you're trying to progress. Having somebody up at full health compared to half health is going to really help basically keep the group alive and try to prevent group wipes that way. So Magicka Templars typically, I think, have a very good spot as an alternative range DPS method spec to choose from, as well as providing some group utility with that faster res time. So just like our other build videos, we'll be going over our gear, we'll be going over attributes, skills, everything that you need to know about this build. And then we'll be talking a little bit about our rotation, kind of go over exactly what's going on with the rotation, why we're using certain skills, what kind of skills you can substitute, things like that. And then we'll close things off with a 6 million dummy part so you guys can get an idea of the DPS you were able to pull with this particular build set. Now, without further ado, let's go ahead and get started here. We'll first start off with gear, as we normally do. And we are going with Zaan. This is a melee build. You can actually use this particular build as a ranged build. You just have to replace one skill, and then you have a ranged build. And if you are going with range, and you will be going with Scoria instead of Zaan, and if you are going to be going with Scoria, you can go with all Magicka enchants. Because we are using Witchmother's Potent Brew, you do need to have a health enchant on one of our large pieces, so I have it here on my helm. If you don't have access to Scalecaller Peak, or you can't finish Scalecaller Peak for whatever reason, then you can go with Grothdarr instead if you are a melee DPS. The disadvantage of Zaan is the fact that it is only single target versus Grothdarr, which does have additional cleave. So if you are going to be using Grothdarr, you will have better AoE damage, but you will be giving up on some single target damage. It might be useful to have both Zaan and Grothdarr, using Grothdarr for trash pulls and then using Zaan for boss fights where you don't need necessarily additional cleave. So that's something to keep in mind if you're going to be using Zaan, but Zaan is going to be the best for single target DPS. Now for our first 5-piece set, we have Siroria. We have the perfect version here. The imperfect version just loses on the max Magicka bonus from the 5-piece effect. Siroria comes from the new trial Cloud Rest. In order to get the perfected boost, you will need to have all 5 of your armor pieces be perfected. So if you don't have, if you have one imperfect version, then you will lose that 5-piece max Magicka bonus there. So that's got the difference between perfect and imperfect versions here. We have all divines with all Magicka enchants here, and this is going to be our body set. So this is going to be on either our body or our 3 jewelry pieces. Now for our second set, we're going with Burning Spellweave. You can go with some other sets here, and I do have them listed down in the description below. You can go with Mother's Sorrow, you can go with Acuity. Those are the main 2 that I would recommend going for. You can also go with Moondancer as well if you would like. I don't recommend going Moondancer necessarily, just because you will be doubling up on that Minor Slayer bonus there. So it's pretty much going to be a waste of a one set bonus. So I don't recommend going Moondancer and Siroria instead. If you do go Moondancer, then you can move Burning Spellweave onto your body. You just don't want to, you want to avoid doing 2 Minor Slayer sets if you can. So for our jewelry, we have 2 spell damage enchants and then 1 Magicka Regen enchant. That's just to help out our sustain, because we do need a little bit of help with sustain overall. You have 1 Bloodthirsty and 2 Arcane. You can go with 3 Bloodthirsty, or you can go with 3 Arcane. You can go with really any combination of Bloodthirsty and Arcane. That's generally going to, they're going to be pretty close together, so it doesn't really matter what combination you have here. Then for our front bar, we have an Infused Inferno Staff with a flame damage enchant. And then for our back bar, we have an Infused Maelstrom Inferno Staff with a weapon damage enchant. You could go with Nirnhoned if you would like. I prefer going with Infused, however. So that's pretty much it. You can go with Infused on your large pieces if you would like instead of Divines. The difference is pretty small overall. Infused is going to be a little bit better by about 0.1 to 0.2%. So it really depends on what you manage to get first. If you manage to get Divines first, then you can go with Divines. If you manage to get Infused, you can go with Infused instead. The DPS difference is so small that you can pretty much chalk it up to pretty much random chance in many scenarios. So it doesn't really matter if you go all Divines or you go large Infused. If you do go large Infused, just remember that try to keep your health enchant piece to be Divines, just because Infused health will only give you more health, not necessarily more DPS that way. So you do want to make sure you have Divines on your whichever large piece has your health enchant. Now for our, going over our character sheet, we are a Dark Elf. Dark Elves do have the best boost to flame damage. They have 7% additional flame damage compared to the High Elves' 4%. And Templars do have more sources of fire damage compared to any other sort of elemental damage, so Dark Elves is going to be better overall. But you can be High Elves if you would like, or you can be Bretons instead. Dark Elves get 9% max Magicka, and they get the 7% additional flame damage, plus 2% to Shock and Frost. High Elves get 10% max Magicka, 9% Magicka Regen, so that helps out your sustain, plus they get 4% to Flame, Shock, and Frost damage. Then Bretons get 10% max Magicka, they gain 3960 additional spell resistance, so that helps out your survivability by a pretty large margin. And then they also gain 3% cost reduction to any Magicka abilities that they use, so that helps out your sustain as well. Not quite as useful as the 9% Magicka Regen from High Elves, but still more useful than the Dark Elves sustain bonuses, which are pretty much nothing at this point. For our attributes, we have 64 points into Magicka here. That leaves us with 16,360 health, so that's a little bit on the low end, but if you are experienced enough with the trial, if you know the mechanics and you're experienced enough with the Magicka Templar, then that's perfectly fine. If you do feel like you need more health to hit 17k or so, you can shift 4 or 5 points out of Magicka into health if you would like. It's kind of up to you. I personally don't have any issues running this amount of health in vet trials. For our Munda Stone, we're going with the Thief. The Thief does actually win out against the Apprentice by about anywhere from a half to 1% DPS, depending on a specific class. But you can go with the Apprentice instead if you would like. The primary kind of tipping point here is basically going to be Warhorn uptime. If you're able to get very good Warhorn uptime, very good Major Force uptime, then the Thief will almost always win out against the Apprentice. If, on the other hand, you have lower Warhorn uptimes, your Warhorn uptimes aren't as good, then you're going to want to go with the Apprentice instead, just because the Thief will definitely have better synergy with Warhorn compared to the Apprentice. But generally speaking, the Thief will be a little bit better. Now, if you do not have Alkosh in the group, if you don't have all of your debuff sets, then you can go with the Lover instead. Just you have to remember that the penetration cap is 18,200. So if running the Lover puts you close to that cap with all your debuffs taken into consideration, and you're still not over it, then stick with the Lover instead. That's going to give you more DPS overall. If running the Lover puts you over the penetration cap by a decent margin, then it might be worth running Thief and the Apprentice, or the Apprentice instead, and then basically make up that extra penetration you might need with the CP points into Spell Erosion. So I'll talk about a little bit more about that later on. For our food, we're going with Witchmother's Potent Brew. You can go with the gold food. This is on the PTS, so we don't have access to the gold food on the PTS, but there is Clockwork Citrus Filet, which is the gold version of Witchmother's Potent Brew. So a little bit better overall, not quite as strong as Witchmother's, but it is more expensive to make or to buy. You can buy it off of Guild Traders. So for now, we're using Witchmother's Potent Brew, which is perfectly fine for our purposes. Now for our skills. So we do have a little bit of flexibility here depending on if you want to be ranged or melee. So this is going to be a melee setup. So we have Elemental Weapon. This is from the Sigil Order skill line. Solar Barrage. This is a melee setup. So we have Solar Barrage, Blazing Spear, Radiant Oppression, Inner Light, and then we have Fiery Rage. This is going to be our primary ultimate, as well as being here for the Ancient Knowledge passive. Now for our back bar, we have Vampire's Bane. You can go with the other morph of Vampire's Bane, which is Reflective Light. It's really dependent on you. Reflective Light will give you a little bit more cleave damage overall, so it's kind of up to you which one you want to pick. Blockade of Fire, Channeled Focus for the Magicka Regen, as well as our major resistance buffs. This is where our shield would be. We have Elemental Drain here for the purposes of the parse, but you would normally have either Harness Magic or Dampen Magic here. It's up to you which one you want to use. And then we have Rearming Trap. This is a melee build, so if you, since we are within melee range, we're able to use Rearming Trap in order to gain our minor force. And then we have Empowering Sweeps here. This is here for the Blazing Spear passive, the Piercing Spear passive here. However, we're not going to be using this at all unless you are using Master Architect into Siroria, in which case this will be your primary ultimate that you will be using instead. Now, like I said, this is a melee build, but if you want to go with the range, then you will basically swap out Solar Barrage here with Purifying Light. So this is what your front bar would look like, and then your back bar you'd be taking out Rearming Trap, and you can use either Channeled Acceleration for the minor force. You can go with Balance for the additional sustain if you'd like, because ranged DPS, ranged version of this build does have worse sustain overall because we won't be able to use our secondary resource for a global cooldown. So you can go with Balance, or you can just stick with Inner Light. It's up to you which of those three abilities you want to go for. Now I will show you the melee version because the melee version overall is going to be a little bit stronger compared to the ranged version. So for our spam build, we are using Elemental Weapon. You can go with Force Pulse or Crushing Shock instead if you would like. Ele Weapon is just going to be cheaper. It costs 20-30 max Magicka versus Force Pulse, which costs 23-22. So it does start to add up. It does help our sustain a little bit. So that's why we're going with Ele Weapon instead of Force Pulse for our spam build. You can also go with Sweeps here on the front bar here. Sweeps generally is also going to be better for sustain because even though it does cost more Magicka, it is a channeled ability, so you aren't going to be casting Puncturing Sweeps as often as you would be with Elemental Weapon or Force Pulse, so it does help our sustain a little bit there. But it is going to be weaker overall compared to using Elemental Weapon here. Now for our CPs. We have 250 CPs for each of our three different constellation types. So starting off with our green CPs, we have 75 into Arcanist and 75 into Tenacity. That leaves 100 points, which you can put into the remaining nodes however you'd like. It's kind of up to you how you want to put them, and it really depends on which kind of passives you want. So I have 40 Shadow Ward, 31 Tumbling, and 29 Warlord, which you can split them up however you'd like, depending on specific, the specific passives you want, as well as the specific content that you're running. For our blue CPs, I have 61 into Elfborn, 56 into Elemental Expert, and 16 into Spell Erosion. We have 56 into Master at Arms, 21 into Staff Expert, and 40 into Thaumaturge. Now I do want to give a little bit of explanation here to Spell Erosion. Now this build is optimized around having Infused Torx Crusher as well as Alkosh. So that's why we have so few points into Spell Erosion here. If we don't have Infused Torx Crusher, if we have just plain Crusher, just a plain Infused Crusher, we would have to add a couple more points into Spell Erosion. If we have don't have Alkosh, and we aren't running the Lover, we might need to put even more points into Spell Erosion here. So remember, just try to get as close as you can to the penetration cap of 18,200. Just figure out how many points you need to put into Spell Erosion here. If you do need to put points into Spell Erosion, the first thing I would do is take Elfborn down to 56. I wouldn't take any more points out of Elemental Expert and Elfborn that way, so keep them down to 56 as your minimum. Then you can probably take out of Staff Expert first is what I would start with, and then you can start taking out of Master at Arms. You might want to keep Thaumaturge at around 40-44, just because Templars do have a little bit more dots compared to other Magicka builds, so you do want to keep a couple more points into Thaumaturge compared to Master at Arms, if you are going to be shifting points around that way. Then for our red CPs, I take a one-size-fits-most approach for these builds, but depending on the specific trial you're running, you might want to shift your CP points around to kind of minimize the damage you'll be taking overall. So for our balanced approach, we're going 66 into Ironclad, 56 into Thick-Skinned, and 64 into Hardy and Elemental Defender. Now I do want to point out Bastion and Quick Recovery. If you put 11 points into either of them, you will hit the A jump point, and you will gain the Field Position passive, which reduces the damage you take by 15% while you're resurrecting another player. As a Templar, you will be resurrecting players very, very often because of that passive that speeds up your resurrection time. So it might be worth putting 11 points into Quick Recovery or Bastion, so that way you have that additional damage mitigation while you're resurrecting somebody. It's not absolutely necessary, but it is a nice passive to get if you have the points to spare. Alright, so now let's talk about our rotation overall. So we'll go over here to this 6 million dummy so you guys can get a sense of the rotation. So I like to start things off making sure I'm buffed. So I always will throw down my rune focus, my challenge focus here for the additional resistance buff as well as the max Magicka bonus. And then I like to start things off with an ultimate and then rearming trap, because you do want to have minor force up while your ultimate is going. So that's something important to basically keep in mind there. So basically what we're going to be doing is to buff up first with rearming trap. Obviously drink your potion before you start your parts. I lay down a rearming trap and then do my ultimate. I throw a spear down first. So this rotation is going to be what we call a dynamic rotation. So there's not necessarily going to be a fixed rotation because of the way our dots all line up with each other. So basically you're going to want to have something like action duration reminder or Surrender to keep an eye on all the dots that you're going to be running. The two most important dots that you want to have running at all times are going to be Spear and Blockade. You want Spear in order for the Blazing Spear passive, which basically gives you a little bit more DPS. And then you want Blockade for the Maelstrom bonus, the Maelstrom boosts you there. And that's basically the general idea, the general rotation there. Again, it is dynamic, so you will need to use something like Action Duration Reminder or Surrender to kind of keep an eye on all the dots. And it is considered dynamic mainly because of the durations of our dots. So you have a 6-second duration with Solar Barrage, 8 seconds with Blazing Spear, 8 seconds with Blockade, and if you're using Vampire's Bane, that's 11-second dot. If you're using Reflective Light instead of Vampire's Bane, that is a 7-second dot. So that doesn't really line up all too well, and then rearming trap can be considered as a 12-second dot. If you want to take in consideration the arm time, then it's a 10-second dot. And then channeled focus is a 26-second renewal that you're going to have to keep track of. So that's basically why Magicka Templars basically have a dynamic rotation. This is true even if you are doing a ranged build and instead of Solar Barrage you're running Purifying Light. Purifying Light still has a 6-second duration just like Solar Barrage. Or rather, Solar Barrage has an 8-second duration, Purifying Light has a 6-second duration, so that's just something you're going to have to keep in mind there. So I do highly recommend picking up Surrender or Action Duration Reminder or using the in-game buff tracker in order to keep track of the buffs while they're going. So that's pretty much it when it comes to the rotation itself. So now we will be going over 6-minute dummy parts so you guys can get an idea of how much DPS we'll be able to pull overall. So oops, didn't mean to hit that button. So we will be doing a 6-minute dummy parse so you guys get an idea of what's going on, how much DPS you're able to pull, and a general sense of the rotation itself. And so, one thing I do want to mention here is that this is going to be the melee build. The ranged build is going to be pulling a little bit different DPS. From my experience, it's pulled around about like 2k or so less DPS overall, because you do have to remember we are giving up Zaan, we are giving up Solar Barrage, which gives us Empower, which helps out our light attack damage. So we are giving up a couple of things here. Purifying Light is not quite as strong compared to Solar Barrage overall. So that's something to keep in mind when we do our parse here. Oh, one thing I forgot to mention before we start our parse is Execute. So for Execute, what I like to do, I start executing at 25%, so that's when I start using my J-beam. And then the 3 dots that you're going to want to maintain are basically going to be Blockade, Blazing Spear, and then you want to keep Rearming Trap down as well for the minor force boost. So I typically drop all the other dots, so I drop Solar Barrage, I drop Purifying Light, I drop Vampire's Bane or Reflective Light, and I just use Shards, Blockade, and Rearming Trap. You're normally able to get 2 full duration J-beams. Sometimes you might only be able to get one off, depending on if you have to use ultimates or anything like that. So that's the general idea behind execute there, and you guys are going to be able to see that when we do our full parse. Do I have this bar swap delay? No, I don't. Okay. So once we get out of combat with that dummy, we'll go ahead and get started with this dummy here. Right, there we go. So we're going to go ahead and get started with our 6 million dummy parts here, so you guys can get an idea of the kind of DPS you can pull with this build, and kind of have a point of comparison to other builds, Magicka DPS builds. And again, I will try to narrate through the parse if I can. You will typically always be throwing down a rearming trap every time you're on your back bar. I typically put challenge focus down every other time on my back bar, so basically every other blockade is when I'll put it down. And because Solar Barrage does have a cast time before it goes into effect, you can actually cast it a little bit early. Cast it with about 1 second left on the duration, and you will actually get that hit off, that final hit off, so you won't necessarily be wasting it at all. So because of that cast time, it is a little bit clunky to use overall, and you won't necessarily be able to use your spam bowl all that often. You can see here that the duration of Spear and Blockade match up very well. It's mainly Vampire's Bane, or Reflective Light if you're using that, as well as Solar Barrage. So we're at 25% now, so I'm going to be swapping to J-Beam, so I'll be dropping Vampire's Bane, as well as Solar Barrage here. I will be maintaining Spears and Rearming Trap, but I am dropping all my other dots. There we have it. So that's the kind of DPS you can expect to pull on a 6 million dummy with this particular setup here. So we got 38.8k here. So again, going to be lower overall compared to Magicka DKs. Magicka DKs are typically pulling around 41, 42 on a 6 million dummy when you take into consideration all of the sustain stuff that we have to do here. That's kind of one of the main things that kind of prevent us from being as strong as we could. So you can see here that our light attacks are going to be very, very strong here, particularly because we do have Empower from Solar Barrage. If we try to find Empower here, so you see we have 48 ticks of Empowered, so that basically means 48 of our light attacks had that additional boost. So that's about a third of our light attacks. So it's a pretty nice buff to have. You can see Radiant Oppression here does do a fair amount of damage here as our execute, critting max at 42.7, and this will only increase when we have Warhorn and all of our other group buffs, minor Berserk, things like that. Blockade is a very important dot here, and you can see here that Burning Light is actually quite strong. It's actually stronger than Blazing Spear itself. So that's mainly the reason why we want to have Blazing Spear out at all times, for that extra Burning Light passive. This is actually a pretty strong passive overall. So you can see here, again, that it does more damage DPS overall compared to Blazing Spear here. And then Zaan, as you can see, is always going to be very, very strong overall. So the Thief is definitely going to be very strong on the Templar overall because we have that 10% additional crit damage boost. So you can see here our max crit damage was around 91% when we had Minor Force up. But again, you can go with the Apprentice instead if you would like here. You can see with Siroria, the best uptime you can get with the max Siroria bonus is going to be 88%. In a more mobile fight, this will not necessarily be quite as high, but Siroria is going to be generally stronger overall as long as you're able to gain average around 7 or 8 stacks overall. Because of that additional Minor Slayer bonus, it does end up beating Julianos when it comes to DPS, even if you're not able to maintain very good uptimes on the 20 stack. As long as you're gaining good uptimes on up to 7 or 8 stacks, you will typically be outparsing Julianos using Siroria, even the imperfect version there. So you can see Burning Spellweave uptime is 52%. That's pretty much roughly where you'd expect it to sit. The highest I've managed to get was around 58-59%. So anywhere between 50 to 60% is where you should be hovering with Burning Spellweave here. And so that's pretty much it for this build here. We can see Blockade, we dropped off a little bit here. We didn't quite get 155. Blazing Sphere, again, had a couple of drop-offs here. We didn't quite get 155 hits with Blazing Spear. But that's going to be difficult to kind of go over light attack ratios and Blockade and Blazing Spear, just because Solar Barrage does have a channeled time associated with it, so it's going to be a little bit difficult to make an accurate comparison, with light attack weaving, whether or not we did a very good job or not. We had 123 over 155, so that's actually pretty decent. So 123 over 155 is around about 0.8 or so, which is pretty much what we can expect. You can probably put get a little bit higher, but again, it's going to be hard to basically say we did well because Solar Barrage does have that challenge time associated with it, so that does eat up one of our global cooldowns, so that does kind of skew our light attack weaving ratio on the lower end. So that's it for this build video. Hope you guys found it informative. If you guys have any questions or comments about this video, feel free to leave them down in the comment section below. Hope you guys found this video informative, and I will see you guys in the next dungeon.